Welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive. Today we're really going to get into some profound historical lessons on organizational command. We're looking at that intense moment where political decisions meet military reality. We're trying to figure out what separates, incredible success from just catastrophic failure when the stakes are literally national survival.
And this deep dive is, I think, just absolutely crucial for any leader, really, in any field, because what we're looking at is how organizations behave when everything they thought they knew just evaporates.
Their intelligence, their procedures, their core assumptions.
Yeah, exactly. It all just dissolves. And the historical context of war gives us these chillingly clear lessons on what happens when command choices go wrong, but also, on the power of being able to adapt and adapt quickly.
So our mission today is very focused. We want to understand what kind of leadership, what kind of organizational structure you need to have to go from stability to crisis smoothly, or at least as smoothly as possible, and how effective sense-making can stop a system from completely collapsing.
To do that, we've pulled together a really powerful set of sources. We're going to start with a theoretical foundation. It's from H. William Dettmer's work on complex systems, often called the Cynefin framework. That's going to be the lens we use to analyze everything else.
Right. And then we jump straight into the deep end with two case studies from the 1973 War of Yom Kippur. First is Uri Bar-Joseph's analysis, Strategic Surprise or Fundamental Flaws, which details that catastrophic surprise attack on the Israel Defense Forces.
And then we'll contrast that with Risa Brooks' study, An Autocracy at War. It explains Egypt's military effectiveness and how they went from, total failure in 1967 to success in 1973.
It's a remarkable turnaround.
It is. And then finally, we'll look at a different kind of command decision, a cold, calculated one. That's from Louis Morton's historical analysis, Japan's Decision for War, which unpacks the organizational and resource pressures that led to Pearl Harbor.
All right, let's unpack all of this. So let's anchor this whole discussion with H. William Dettmer's work on the Cynefin framework.
I think this is so essential because it gives you a way to visualize how systems work across different environments, right? From the very ordered and predictable to the completely unordered and turbulent.
It is. It forces leaders to ask the most fundamental question, which is, what kind of problem am I actually dealing with right now?
And what's the right way to solve it?
Exactly. And the main lesson from Dettmer is that successful command isn't just about being the expert in the room. It's more about recognition. It's about recognizing which domain you're in, simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic, and then using the right method for that domain.
And he's very clear that it's a tool for sense-making, not just, slapping a label on something.
Yes. You don't just categorize your problem and walk away.
Yeah.
You use the framework to sense where the environment is pushing you.
And a big part of that sense-making is trying to actively avoid that fifth domain he talks about, disorder. Right. Disorder is when you've completely lost the plot. It's where different parts of your own organization think they're in different domains all at once.
So the political leaders think the problem is simple, but the people on the ground know it's chaotic.
Exactly. And the result is this cacophony, total command paralysis. And we are going to see that manifested in the most violent way possible in Israel in 1973.
Okay, so let's walk through the ordered domains first. This is where most organizations feel comfortable.
Right, starting with the simple domain. This is the world of known knowns.
So stable context, cause and effect are crystal clear, outcomes are predictable.
Think of a checklist, an assembly line. The right answer is usually self-evident.
And the method here is sense, categorize, respond. You see the issue, you know what box it fits in, and you apply the standard operating procedure. Best practice.
Right. But Dettmer gives this huge warning about the simple domain. The big danger here is something he calls entrained thinking.
Organizational complacency.
That's it exactly. It's the belief that the system that has always worked will keep working no matter what. And that leads leaders to just resist any kind of adaptation.
And it's why in the framework's diagram, he puts the simple domain right next to the chaotic domain.
Yes. With this, cliff edge between them, it's a profound warning.
That complacency, that failure to see that your stable world has changed, is what causes a system to just collapse straight into chaos.
Without even passing through the other domains, you just fall right off the cliff.
Okay, so then we move to the complicated domain. This is the realm of the known unknowns.
Right. So cause and effect still exists. You can figure them out, but it's not obvious. It takes work. You need specialized expertise. You need deep analysis.
So the method here shifts. It's not just categorize. It's sense analyze, respond.
You know the right questions to ask, but finding the answer, and there might be multiple good answers, takes research. It takes experts.
And organizationally, this is where we see silos, right? Specialized departments.
Absolutely. Think of a car manufacturer. You have the engine department, the transmission department, the chassis experts. Each is a silo of deep knowledge.
And that structure is very efficient for dealing with these kinds of known unknowns.
It is, but Dettmer, and he's really echoing the work of W. Edwards Deming here, he points out the big risk. Management tends to use process improvement tools, like Six Sigma, to make each individual silo as efficient as possible.
Right. They assume that if you optimize all the parts, you've optimized the whole system.
But Deming's whole point was that you can't do that. System-level optimization is different. You might make the engine department hyper-efficient, but in doing so, you create friction or problems at the point where it connects to the transmission department.
So you've sub-optimized the entire car just to perfect one part.
Precisely. And the risk is that the experts in their silos, they become blind to those system-level problems. They're so focused on their own analysis that they miss the bigger picture.
Okay, so now we cross the boundary into the unordered domains. This is where standard analysis starts to fail.
And we start with the complex domain. This is the domain of the unknown knowns.
What's the key characteristic here?
Adaptation and emergence. Think of systems like an ecosystem or a market economy. They have all these different agents, animals, traders, whatever, that are constantly interacting and learning and adapting to each other in real time.
So you can't predict patterns ahead of time.
You can't. You can only see them in retrospect. Dettmer calls it retrospective coherence.
Yeah.
You look back and say, oh, okay, now I see why that happened. But you couldn't have predicted it.
Which means your whole approach to command has to change.
Completely. The methodology here has to be probe, sense, respond.
Experimentation.
Yes. Thoughtful trial and error. You run small, safe-to-fail experiments, you watch the patterns that emerge from the system's reaction, and then you adjust your next move based on that feedback.
And this is where so many leaders struggle, right? They come from these ordered systems, and they just want to control everything.
They do. They try to apply their analytical tools from the complicated world, but in doing that, they stifle the system. They actually prevent those informative patterns from ever emerging.
So you have to be willing to tolerate some failure to learn.
You have to encourage it in a controlled way. The classic example is always Apollo 13.
Right. The problem they had wasn't in any manual.
Not at all. It was an unknown known that emerged in orbit. And Mission Control didn't sit down for a week of analysis. They threw a bunch of experts in a room with only the stuff the astronauts actually had on board.
Just a pile of random material.
Exactly. And they forced a solution to emerge from those constraints. That is pure, complex domain management.
Which brings us to the most turbulent domain of all.
Chaotic.
The realm of the unknown unknowns, the unknowables. The environment is just. It's pure turbulence. Cause and effect are either invisible or they're changing too fast to even analyze.
So you don't have time for experiments.
No. Waiting for patterns to emerge is a death sentence. The method here has to be act, sense, respond.
In decisive, instinctive action. Your only goal is to stabilize the situation, to do something that pushes the system back towards the complex domain where you can at least start to make sense of things again.
And this is the real test for leaders who grew up in predictable systems.
It is. They default to their familiar analytical methods, and it's like trying to navigate a hurricane with a spreadsheet. They're totally ill-suited for it.
And we are about to see exactly what happens when a very capable, very confident military is thrown into this domain with absolutely zero warning.
So let's apply this framework to the start of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Uri Bar-Joseph's analysis is just devastating here. He details how this profound strategic surprise, combined with flaws that were already in the Israel Defense Forces command structure, just plunge them immediately into chaos.
And the opening of that war was an unmitigated disaster for Israel. I mean, it's hard to overstate it. The Suez Canal defense collapsed in hours. Syrian forces almost broke through the Golan Heights.
It was an existential crisis. And the debate afterwards really centered on one question. Was this failure mostly about bad intelligence, the surprise itself? Or was it about fundamental pre-war flaws in how the Israel Defense Forces were structured and prepared?
Let's start with the surprise argument.
Well, the evidence for a massive intelligence failure is just overwhelming. Israeli military intelligence had almost perfect information about the Egyptian and Syrian deployments. They knew where the troops were.
And they had explicit warnings from very reliable sources. King Hussein of Jordan, for one.
And Dr. Ashraf Marwan, a top Egyptian official. They were getting clear signals.
But they still missed it. Why?
A severe cognitive bias. There was this prevailing assumption, this concept, that the Arab armies would never unpack unless they could first achieve air superiority over Israel.
An assumption that proved to be completely wrong.
Fatally wrong. Because of that assumption, Israeli military intelligence estimated the probability of war as low, even just 24 hours before it started.
And that failure was the critical domino.
It was, because it prevented the timely mobilization of the reserve army, which was the backbone of Israel's entire defense plan.
The commander of the Northern Command said that if even one reserve tank brigade had been mobilized in time, the whole picture on the Golan would have been different.
Completely different. The chief of staff said they needed 20 hours of warning. They got almost none.
Okay, but Bar-Joseph also brings up the counterargument about the fundamental flaws that were there before the surprise.
Right. And this is the idea that overconfidence after their massive victory in 1967 led to some really unrealistic operational plans.
They started relying too much on their regular standing army to handle any initial attack.
They did. They assumed their incredible air force would just neutralize any threat, particularly anti-air defenses, right at the start.
Which led to a really unbalanced force structure.
A profoundly unbalanced force. They poured resources into air power and their tank corps, which were amazing.
But they did it at the expense of things like infantry, artillery, and combat engineering.
The very forces you need to counter new, unexpected technologies. Which is exactly what they faced.
The Sagar anti-tank missiles.
Thousands of them. Suddenly, Israeli tanks were facing a threat they were structurally, fundamentally unprepared to deal with.
So how does Bar-Joseph reconcile these two things? The surprise versus the flaws.
His conclusion is nuanced. He says that while the preparation flaws were absolutely real, he calls them an intervening variable, the strategic surprise was the independent variable. The surprise is what doomed the initial phase of the war.
So you're saying the flaws were only exposed because of the pressure of the surprise?
That's his argument. He suggests that if they had gotten their 5-day warning, if the system had been fully mobilized,
the flaws might not have mattered as much?
They might have been masked. The Israel Defense Forces would have been operating in the complicated domain, executing their plans. But because the surprise was so total, the entire system was instantly thrown into chaos. And in a chaotic environment, those existing flaws become lethal.
So the failure wasn't just the plan, it was the organizational rigidity. They were a complicated domain military that had no idea how to operate in a chaotic one.
No idea how to act, sense, respond. Let's look at the specific failures on the ground because they are just textbook examples of command breaking down.
Okay, let's start on the Suez front. The first mistake, manning the Bar-Lev line.
So these forts were supposed to be the eyes and ears of the defense, right? The plan called for them to be manned by high-quality, regular service paratroopers in case of war.
A simple, clear process.
Exactly, a simple domain procedure. But instead, they were manned by second-rate reservists. Older, poorly trained. Some were even assigned there as a form of educational punishment.
It's incredible.
It is. 14 of the 30 forts were completely unmanned. So from the first second of the war, they weren't an asset. They were a liability that needed rescuing.
And you contrast that with the Golan strongholds.
A night and day difference.
Okay.
Those were manned by professional, regular infantry, and those positions fought effectively even when they were totally surrounded.
The second Suez mistake is a perfect example of that failed sense-making under pressure. Deployment delay.
This one is just tragic. It's about Division 252, commanded by Major General Shmuel Gonen.
He was told at 6 in the morning to prepare for a war that was expected at 6 in the evening.
Right, but he was still influenced by that flawed intelligence assessment. He didn't really believe it was coming. He was also worried about political provocation, so he deliberately delayed deploying his force of 300 tanks.
He was still in a complicated mindset. Sense, analyze, respond, waiting for more data.
Exactly. But the environment had already shifted to chaotic. The Egyptians secretly moved their attack time up to 2 p.m. When the attack actually started, Gonen had only 3 tanks in position where there should have been 220.
And because of that hesitation,
32,000 Egyptian soldiers crossed the Suez Canal in rubber boats, completely unopposed, during the most vulnerable part of their operation. A catastrophic failure.
Okay, let's move north to the Golan Heights. The mistakes there seem rooted in just systemic chaos.
Complete disorder. The third critical mistake was the failure to deploy a plan they already had, Plander.
Commanders had the time and the forces available to deploy according to their pre-war plans. But they didn't.
No, because the entire Northern Command was still set up for a small local clash, not a full-scale war. When the shooting started, the command and control system it melted down.
That's the story of the war room at Nafak, right?
Yes. This one tiny bunker crammed with nearly 200 people from all different command levels. Brigade staff, command staff. It was informational and physical chaos.
And that chaos leads directly to the fourth mistake, the misallocation of their reserve forces.
Right. Because they couldn't sense the environment accurately, the commanders were operating on a totally mistaken assumption. They thought the main Syrian attack was coming in the north, so they sent their stronger unit, Brigade 7, up there,
leaving the weaker Brigade 188 to face the actual main attack in the south,
where the Syrians had deployed 360 of their 600 tanks. That sector, outnumbered and outgunned, just collapsed. It shows how, in a state of disorder, every decision you make is poisoned by bad data and panic.
And that panic on the ground feeds all the way up to the political level, right? Impacting the Air Force.
Massively. The Air Force had this incredibly complex, well-prepared plan to destroy the Egyptian anti-aircraft missile sites. It was called Operation Tagar 4.
Sophisticated plan, ready to go.
Over 100 Phantom jets, electronic warfare. It had a very high chance of success.
Which brings us to mistake number 5. Calling it off.
Yes. The defense minister, Moshe Dayan, visits the Golan Front and sees the collapse. He panics. He genuinely believed the state was facing the end of the Third Temple and demanded that the Air Force divert everything north to stop the Syrian tanks.
So a plan that was critical to the entire war was canceled in minutes because of one person's panicked reaction to chaos on the ground.
It's chilling. They abandoned a carefully constructed, complicated domain solution for a chaotic, improvised act.
And that impulse led directly to the 6th and final mistake we'll cover.
The launch of Operation Dugman 5. This was the hasty replacement operation against the Syrian anti-aircraft systems.
It was rushed.
Completely rushed. It lacked all the critical elements, updated photos, artillery support, electronic warfare. It failed, and it failed at a high cost. It's the perfect example of a disastrous act-sense-respond cycle. It's just acting out of desperation. The surprise was the spark. Bar-Joseph makes that clear.
But it's the rigidity and the terrible command decisions under pressure that turned a crisis into a catastrophe.
Now, if Israel is a story of failure from surprise and rigidity, Risa Brooks's work on Egypt is this incredible contrast. It shows how the whole organizational climate of a military determines its ability to learn, adapt, and actually execute a strategy.
I mean, Egypt's turnaround is just phenomenal, from total embarrassing failure in 1967 to real strategic success in 1973.
And Brooks argues that you can't understand that without looking at domestic politics, specifically the balance of civil-military power inside that autocratic regime.
And that balance shaped everything.
Everything. Strategic assessment, command and control, who got promoted, all of it.
Okay, so let's start with the 1967 failure. What was the power dynamic then?
Brooks calls it shared power. You had President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the political leader, sharing power with his military chief, Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer.
And this wasn't a partnership.
Not at all. It was an intense rivalry. Amer basically built his own parallel power structure within the military. He used patronage, special privileges, social clubs to create an officer corps that was loyal only to him. He was a political counterweight to Nasser.
And that internal competition created these fatal organizational problems.
Absolutely. Look at their strategic assessment. Amer would carefully guard military information, sometimes even change it, to protect his own political position.
So he was actively dismissing Nasser's warnings about a preemptive strike from Israel.
He was. There was no real joint coordination possible. It was all politicized.
And that flowed down into command and control.
Oh, it was a convoluted mess. Both leaders were putting in their own checks and balances against the other. Amer created a separate ground forces command just to sideline a chief of staff that Nasser supported. So you had two competing staffs.
And it got even worse right before the war.
It did. Amer created an advanced command post in the Sinai, but its real purpose was to keep him close to Cairo so he could keep an eye on Nasser. The commanders on the ground had no clear idea who was in charge.
And I assume the appointments, the leadership, was just as politicized.
Fatally so. Amer protected his incompetent friends and sidelined talented professionals. The result was that key defensive plans, like their main one, the Kahir plan, were never even distributed or practiced. The people who wrote it had been removed for political reasons.
So when the fighting started, the whole thing just disintegrated.
It was a house of cards. A mayor's panicked, uncoordinated withdrawal order from the Sinai, made without consulting anyone, just cemented the disaster. The competition at the top led to total collapse on the battlefield.
So what changed between 67 and 73?
The defeat itself. The 1967 loss was so profound, the military's social status just plummeted. And Nasser, and later Anwar Sadat, seized that moment to purge a mayor's entire clique.
So Sadat inherited a totally different system.
Yes, a system of political dominance. His civilian coalition was clearly in charge of a military that was now divided and much less influential.
And that dominance gave him the freedom to actually reform the system.
Crucially, it allowed him to rationalize the command structure and push the military toward a more professional, complicated domain approach to planning.
And it started with appointments.
It had to. Sadat got control of the promotion committees. He got rid of the political hacks and put in skilled, non-political professionals. People like Ahmed Ismail Ali as Minister of War and Mohammad Ghamasi as Chief of Operations. These were men who understood the link between military operations and political strategy.
And with new leadership came a new way of doing strategic assessment.
A much more rational way. Sadat used the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces for actual consultation. But most importantly, Sadat himself directed a limited war strategy, Operation Spark.
This was a really clear-eyed decision, right?
It was, acknowledging Egypt's weaknesses. They knew they couldn't beat Israel in a sweeping offensive war. They didn't have the air power. So they weren't aiming for total victory. They were aiming for strategic leverage.
And that clarity of purpose allowed for incredibly professional execution.
A plan that played to their strengths. It relied on their superior numbers and on highly scripted training.
Which, as Brooks notes, was perfect for their force, which was made up of a lot of low-literacy rural recruits.
Right. Mechanical repetition of acquired skills. It was a simple domain approach to tactics, and it worked.
And they built the whole plan around negating Israel's biggest strength.
The Israeli Air Force. They invested everything in this massive surface-to-air missile umbrella. And to make it all work, they had an elaborate deception plan with incredible operational security. Most of their own troops didn't know they were attacking until minutes beforehand.
But the most important thing was that the command integrity held.
It was rock solid. The chain of command from Sadat down to Ismail and his generals was firm. There's a famous moment where Sadat sided with his Minister of War to hold their position on the east bank of the canal, despite huge pressure from other generals to advance and risk everything.
So that structural integrity, free from the rivalry of 1967, was the key.
It was. It shows that command effectiveness is really a function of organizational structure. A rationalized structure under unified political control can achieve its goals even with limited means.
As long as the strategy is aligned with those means.
Exactly. They avoided the disorder that crippled Israel by operating in a highly planned, highly predictable, complicated domain framework.
Okay, so we've seen command reacting to chaos and command adapting structurally. Now let's turn to Louise Morton's analysis of Japan in 1941. This is a totally different story. This is a deliberate, calculated command decision that, despite being executed almost perfectly, was based on a huge strategic miscalculation.
It's a fascinating case because this wasn't a failure of execution or even really of structure. It was a failure of strategic empathy, a critical misreading of the complex geopolitical domain they were operating in.
And Japan had been on this path for a while.
Since 1936, really. Their economy was oriented toward total war, all driven by the Army's goal of securing resources in Southeast Asia.
And the whole decision process was driven by one critical constraint.
Oil. A severe shortage of oil. Japan was completely dependent on imports from the United States.
And nothing they tried. Conservation, synthetic fuels, could change that fundamental reality.
Not for waging a modern war, no. And that oil bottleneck defined their entire strategy. Securing the oil fields in the Netherlands Indies became the absolute top priority.
Because without them, their own military reserves would run dry in less than 2 years.
Right, which is why the diplomatic deadlock became the final trigger.
The U.S. position on China, the open door policy.
Those were terms the Japanese military saw as total submission. And when the U.S. froze their assets and imposed the economic blockade, it basically started a countdown clock.
The choice became submission or war.
Submission and a slow decline, or war while they still had the fuel to fight it. The U.S. position, in effect, forced them onto an irreversible path.
And unlike Israel's reactive crisis management, Japan's move to war was this systematic, calculated march.
A very methodical, complicated domain effort.
The planning timeline was set in stone at the Imperial Conferences in 1941.
Definitive deadlines. Military preparations had to be complete by the end of October. If negotiations failed by early October, the decision for war would be finalized.
There was no improvisation here.
None. They were executing a pre-planned schedule toward an irreversible event.
And the strategic objectives were just as clear.
Sequential and clear. First, hit the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Second, neutralize U.S. forces in the Philippines to secure their flank. And then, with that done, rapidly conquer the entire southern area for its resources.
And executing that plan required some serious internal alignment. The Pearl Harbor attack itself was controversial.
Very. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan was initially met with intense resistance from the Navy's own planners.
They thought it was too risky.
Way too risky. What if the fleet wasn't in port? What if they were discovered early? But Yamamoto understood that the entire southern strategy was impossible if the American fleet was still a threat. So he leveraged his immense prestige, he threatened to resign, and the command structure eventually fell in line.
But this is where the real failure happens. Not in the plan's execution, but in the mindset they applied to the larger geopolitical environment.
The long-term vision. This is the great miscalculation.
Japan's ultimate goal wasn't to invade and occupy the United States.
No, not at all. It was to establish a massive, fortified defensive perimeter, all the way from the Kuril Islands down to Burma. And using the new resources from that territory, the oil, the rubber, they calculated that they could wage a defensive war almost indefinitely.
Until the United States, distracted by the war in Europe, would be forced to negotiate a compromise.
And allowed Japan to keep most of its gains.
So they were operating in the complex domain of great power politics, but they were using simple domain assumptions about their adversary.
Exactly. They assumed the American reaction would be logical, measured, a cost-benefit analysis. They completely failed to account for the psychological impact of a massive, unprovoked surprise attack on the American people.
They calculated logistics perfectly.
To the barrel of oil. But they failed utterly to calculate the enemy's political and psychological response. And that is a failure of sense-making in a complex environment.
A lack of strategic empathy.
A fatal lack of it. Believing your enemy will fight a limited war after you've delivered a mortal wound. That was the flaw.
So the timeline reached its end. Negotiations were terminated in late November.
And the military machine was already in motion. The striking force was sailing for Pearl Harbor.
And the final act of command was just executed with this cold precision.
Chilling precision. The final note, which was basically an ultimatum, was approved to be delivered to the Secretary of State 30 minutes after the attack was scheduled to begin.
So this intense focus on operational timing completely divorced from any sense of strategic empathy. That's the real lesson.
It is. The command structure was masterful in organizing and executing its short-term objective.
Destroying the fleet.
Yes. But it was catastrophically short-sighted in assessing the long-term consequences. They confused their own desire for a limited negotiated war with their adversary's absolute determination for total victory.
Well, this deep dive has, I think, really shown us that the art of command is less about individual heroism.
Right, and more about organizational design, structural integrity, and maybe most of all, just having a correct awareness of your context. Absolutely. We saw that systems under shared power, like Egypt in 1967, they just collapse from internal politics.
While systems under political dominance, like Egypt in 1973, can actually rationalize and adapt their strategy to fit their real-world limitations.
And critically, we saw that a stable system that gets forced into a chaotic domain by a surprise, like Israel in 1973, will just crumble.
Unless its leaders can immediately shed their old methods and embrace that rapid act-sense-respond improvisation to stabilize things.
And maybe the most sobering lesson is from Japan in 1941, that even the most perfect planning, a masterpiece of execution, is worthless if your core assumption about your enemy's psychology is just fundamentally wrong.
So what does this all mean for you as a leader trying to navigate your own, turbulent environments?
It means you have to know what kind of problem you have. You have to use a framework like Cynefin. Do you need that fast, instinctive response for a chaotic situation, or do you need the slow, deep analysis of a complicated problem?
And if you're lucky enough to be succeeding in the simple domain, are you actively on guard against that complacency, that entrained thinking that could drop you right off the cliff into chaos?
So the final provocative thought I want to leave you with is this. The Japanese command decision in 1941 was an unparalleled display of operational planning. It was based on a logical calculation that their new defensive perimeter would eventually force the Americans to the negotiating table. But given that history shows us that major powers almost never accept a limited war after being hit with a massive surprise attack, does the very act of meticulously planning for a long-term defense after a huge preemptive strike, does that itself represent a fundamental failure of command imagination?
A failure to imagine the enemy's psychological will.
Exactly. It wasn't the logistical plan that was flawed. It was the psychological assessment of their adversary that doomed them from the very beginning. And that distinction, the one between organizational competence and strategic empathy, might be the deepest lesson of command there is.